I received some money. Back then in in the 70s, it was quite a large amount of money, but it was only like $400. But back then, $400. When you consider that when I worked, I only made $1.25 an hour. So, my take-home pay was like $30. So $400 was a lot of money. And I'd received this from a company I'd worked for, and it was they were paying me my retirement money because I only worked for the company for a year. And so anyhow, they sent me this money. And when I got back to college, one of my roommates came up to me and wanted to know if he could borrow $5. And he didn't know I had the money. And so I had cashed the check when I was home up in Syracuse and brought the money back with me and said, let's see what I can do. And I reached into my pocket, pulled out this wad, and I'm going through it. Let's see. There's a 5. And I was just kidding around. And so, I gave him the 5, and he's looking at me, and he looks at my roommates, and he's going, where's this money coming from? And so, just joking, we said, I just received a big inheritance. And well, to make a long story short, we played this on this guy for a while, but he went around and spread it around the college. And before long, I had more friends than I knew what to do with. It was totally amazing. Even my resident assistant, or the guy that was the dorm parent, all of a sudden he's coming to my room now and talking to me. He usually comes to my room to talk to me, but it's usually, get your bed made, here's a demerit for this. But now he's my buddy. All these people were my friends until I finally put an end to the whole charade and said, listen, it was just a joke. I really didn't. I just got some money back, and it wasn't that, it was $400 or $600, whatever the amount was. And it went on my school bill. So I have no cash. There's no money for anybody. And all of a sudden I lost all my friends.
They weren't friends.
Yeah. And in this particular portion of Scripture, I don't know if you noticed, if you took the time to read it beforehand, that David is going to run into a bunch of friends. Well, let's begin. We're going to look at scene number 1. This is where it starts in verse 13 of chapter 15. And it says, and there came a messenger to David saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. David has gotten into some trouble here because of the chain of events that took place since Bathsheba. And Nathan's warning to him about things that would happen. We find the rape of his daughter. We find the deaths of 2 sons. And Absalom flees from him. And finally he brings Absalom back, but puts him in house arrest. And Absalom's not a happy camper until he finally gets out of it. And he tells David that he has made a pledge or a promise. And so he wants to go to Hebron and take care of it. Well, really what he's doing is he's plotting against David. And all this time, David, whether David knows it or not, and I have a feeling David probably had a clue. But because what we've seen in David's life is David doesn't seem to want to do things about stuff. He just wants to get along. And, getting along's good. How many of you are following the events in Ferguson? Right now, the what's going on there is, it reminded me of David, is that the authorities are arresting people all over the place, but I don't think they're going to prosecute anybody. And what they're doing is they say, we just don't want to stir up more trouble. Well, the problem is what they should do, at least in my book, is every single person that broke the law should get arrested and should get prosecuted to the full extent. Because this is exactly what they were asking for, is justice. And so David doesn't want to cause problems. And so he kind of just lets Absalom go and do what he wants to do. Well, Absalom is rising up against him, and the people are. So we find in this verse, it says the people are starting to follow him. So David, at this particular point, will go on and says, and the king sent forth and all his household after him. Go back to verse 14 of chapter 15. And David said, and all the servants that were with him in Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, for we shall not escape Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring evil upon us and smite the city with the sword. And go down to verse 16. It says, and the king sent forth all his household after him, and the king left 10 women, which were concubines, to keep his house. Now, a concubine was technically a wife. The thing is that they weren't regular wives. But David had so many of these things. He's got at least 10 concubines. At least he's not like Solomon, who had 600 concubines and 300 wives. Or no, he had 1,000 altogether. But, he had all of these. I don't know how he keeps track of them all. Can you imagine what anniversaries are like and Christmas? If you got all that? But he's going to leave these 10 women behind. But what he does is he says, we're going to flee. We're going to get out of Jerusalem. So in this first scene, we find him he's at the palace. He gets this news that Absalom's rising up against him. He says, everybody, gather everything together. We're out of here. But I'm going to leave behind 10 of my wives. And their job, clean house. That's why he's leaving them. Now, that tells me something about Absalom. He's not, about David. He's not abdicating the throne. He's fleeing right now because he feels he's in danger. But he's looking at the idea that I'm coming back again. And so he leaves the 10 wives there, the concubines, to take care of the estate while he's gone, the palace, his house. And so he grabs the family and goes. And so where we find David, because of his failure to really take care of things, now he is fleeing for his life again, just like he was with Saul. But this time he's fleeing from his own son. Now, he was warned about what would happen. He was warned about some of the things that would take place. His son's dying and how his family would rise up against him. And now we're beginning to see this come to fruition. Well, the second scene takes place in verse 17 down through verse 22. And this one, we're going to find some old friends and some new friends. And it says, and the king went forth and all the people after him and tarried in a place that was afar off. And all the servants passed by beside him, and there were the Sherethites and the Pelethites and all the Gittites. The Gittites are from Gath. That's where Goliath was from. And he says, 600 men which came after him from Gath passed on before the king. So we've got all these different groups of people, and we're not going to take time to look at all of them, but a lot of these were Gentiles. But these were people who swore allegiance to David. And so David's got all these people. But what's interesting is we come to verse 19. It says, the king, and then said the king to Ittai, the Gittite, wherefore goest thou also with us? Return to the place and abide with the king, for thou art a stranger and also an exile. And whereas thou camest but yesterday, should I this day make thee go up and down with us? So he's got this guy who's a newcomer. This guy's just got into town. He hasn't been there very long. And all of a sudden, as David is watching the people pass by, and this is where we see as David is watching all these people go by, and he sees this guy. Now, something happened that he knew who this person was. But this person is a Gittite. He's from Gath. He's a Gentile. And David looks at him and says, hey, what are you doing? Why are you coming with us? You don't have to be here. You're in exile from your own town. You're going to be in trouble if you travel with me. Really, you're going to be a burden on us because just more mouths to feed. But at the same time, he says, listen, you don't have to feel obligated to come. You can leave anytime you want. Now, I love this guy's response. This is a friend. Because here he is. He's the new guy in town. And he says in verse 22, in Ittai he answered the king and said, as the Lord liveth and as my lord the king liveth, surely in what place my lord the king shall be, whether it be death or life, even there also will thy servant be. And so David said, okay, you can come with us. Now here's loyalty. The winds of war are here. There's a chance of death. The Absalom is ready to take over, will do whatever it takes. And this guy is given a choice to say, hey, you come with us or stay. And being a new guy, you would think, well, really, I don't have any loyalties really to David yet, but yet he is already. So this is the kind of friend I want. I want somebody who's going to stick with me no matter what. Now, we're going to see in a little while, there's another guy who's been with David right along. And he turns his back on David and goes the opposite way. He's the kind of guy that, what's happening? The polls, yeah, I'm pointing at you, Robert. Now get in here and take a seat. We're talking in the back about knowing where we stand. And I was joking. I said, I know where I stand. I took a poll today, and that's what we hear politicians do. And we see the politicians go one way or the other way. It depends on what the polls are. Well, we as Christians, we ought to take a stand on what we believe, and we ought to take a stand with the people that we believe with and be willing to stand with them no matter what. And sometimes in churches, we have a tendency to eat our own people instead of standing with them. There was an interesting article I had read actually, I believe it was Thanksgiving morning. We talked a little bit about it at the Thanksgiving table. But the idea of friendship is so changed lately because we no longer have the close personal relationships oftentimes. That's right. This is what we do. We text people. We send emails and stuff. And I personally don't like it. If my daughter texts me or something, I have a tendency to pick up the phone and call her because I want to talk to her. I want to hear her voice. I want to hear the kids. I want to hear little Addie singing in the background. That's a book for me. I want that personal relationship with people that you can have. And so here's this guy that comes along and says, hey, I haven't known you that long, but you're the king, and I respect you. Whatever his reasons for, he says, I'm going to stick with you. So in this second scene, we've got David watching all these people go by, and he's looking at people and wondering, why are you here? And he picks this guy out, and this guy says, well, this is why I'm here. And so he tells David that he's planning on saying, he says, no matter what, I'm going to stick with you. The third scene, what's happening here is David is leaving Jerusalem. He's working his way around, and he's going to end up in the wilderness eventually. Now the wilderness, when it's talking about the wilderness here, it's speaking about the area on the other side of the Jordan River, north of Jerusalem. Other places in the scripture, when you hear the wilderness talked about, it's actually south down in the Negev area. But here where he's referring to, and we see where he goes, he's going to head north, and then he's going to head over onto the other side of the Jordan River. It's not a very populated area. It's a place where he probably feels safe. Whether or not Absalom is willing to go that far to go after him or not. So that's where David goes. So this next thing we find that he's crossing the Kidron River. Now, anybody familiar with that little river? It's not really a river. Matter of fact, there's places it's probably not much wider than the distance between these chairs here. That's where David got his stones from. So it's not a real big creek, or it's just, it's more of a brook that just kind of runs through the land there, and there's lots of those up there. Even, as a matter of fact, the Jordan River is, it's the Caloosahatchee makes the Jordan River look small. Okay, at least in this area down here. So in verse 23 through 29. And he says, the country wept in a loud voice when all the people passed over, and the king himself, we're in 23 of verse chapter 15, and all the people, and lo, Zadok also of all the Levites were with him, and bearing the ark of the covenant. So now they got the ark with them. They've left Jerusalem, and they've taken the ark with them. And so David is looking at this and saying, really, the ark doesn't belong with me. And so he's going to talk to Zadok, and he's going to say, here's what I need you to do. I need you to take that ark back there. Because if it be God's will, he's going to bring me back there, and I want to be back where the ark is, and I want to be back at God's house. And so he says, I want you to go, and I want you to take your two sons. Now, it's important to keep in mind, he says, I want you to take your two sons, because those two sons are going to come up later. And so he says, I want you to go back and maintain the priesthood. The continuity of God's presence in the city, even though I'm out of here right now. I want you to go back. And so Zadok, he says, oh, okay. And he says, I'm not so sure this is the smartest thing for me to do because, of loyalties and stuff. He says, we'll figure it out. It'll be okay. You just go back and maintain it. And so at the end of this scene, and let's see, in verse 27, the king also said to Zadok the priest, Art thou not a seer? Return to the city in peace, and your two sons with you, and Ahimaaz thy son, and Jonathan thy son, the son of Abiathar. And see if I will tarry in the plain of the wilderness until there come word from you to certify me. And basically he says, when you tell me it's safe. So David is sending him back not simply to have the ark back there, but he wants him to have somebody that he trusts they can keep his thumb on things. He's got an ear to the ground or whatever, ear to the door. He's listening in, so he has an idea. So David is said, I'm leaving town, but I'm going to leave some people behind me that are going to be there for me. And so that's our third scene, is David is moving through. So he sends them back. Now we come to scene 4 in verses 30 through 37. And this takes place on the Mount of Olives. Now, if you've ever seen a map of Jerusalem, Jerusalem basically is almost like a peninsula because it's got valleys. There's a valley that runs up through the middle, but there's valleys on both sides of it. And behind it to the north is mountains, and to the south is valleys. Matter of fact, when David defeated Goliath, that's where he had to. That's where the Philistines were heading, from the south up to Jerusalem, because it's really the only way to approach it. Well, if you picture Jerusalem kind of sitting up on the mountain, if you look to the east of it is where the Mount of Olives is. And so the Mount of Olives, I'm sure you've heard references to it in the New Testament. Jesus went there to pray. And it was directly across from the eastern gate to the city. And so the Mount of Olives is over there. And that's where David is. He's taken this trek. And he's gone south of the city. He's moving up. Now he's at the Mount of Olives. He's going to continue to go north. But now when he gets to the Mount of Olives, and David went up into the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went up, and had his head covered and was barefoot, and all the people were with him. And this is verse 30 of chapter 15. And he covered his head and went up. And one told David, saying, Ahithophel. Now, how many of you remember him? Anybody remember that guy? It's one of those weird names. But he says, listen to what he says about it. He says, he's among the conspirators was Absalom. And David said, Oh Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Now, this guy here was one of the guys that was involved in David and Bathsheba. When David wanted to know who she was and stuff, this was one of his main counselors. This is the guy that's telling David what to do. This is his right-hand man. Now, earlier in the chapter, we've got this nobody at Ittai, who's from Gath, of all places, where David or Goliath was from, and he's saying, I'm going to stick with you forever. Here is one of David's advisors who had been with him right from the beginning. Now all of a sudden, what he's looking at is saying, wait a minute. Oh, the Democrats are in charge now. I'm going to become a Democrat. It sounds like Charlie Crist. I'm going to be a Democrat, I'm going to be a Republican, I'm going to be an independent. This is kind of what he's doing. He's changing with the tide. This is the guy that's a poll taker. He's the guy that's putting his finger in the wind and saying, which way are the winds blowing? And he's deciding, well, David, you were the flavor of the month last month, but this month somebody else is on the throne. And so I'm going to stick with the new guy. Now, I'm sure this was devastating to David. Because what we see here that David is saying is, oh no, this guy knows everything. He knows all about me. He knows what's going on here. He knows my likes, my dislikes, where I got, he knows everything. And he's saying, oh man. And what's his prayer? He says, Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel, I can never pronounce it, Ahithophel into foolishness. And so when it came to pass, when David was come to the top of the mountain where he worshiped God, behold, he said, Hushai, the Arshite, came to meet him with a coat rent and earth upon his head, upon whom David said, if thou passest on with me, thou shalt be a burden with me. And he says, now when he heard this term burden, he says, listen, David's got over 600 people traveling with him now. Have you ever traveled with a large group of people? You keep adding people to it, and what's the problem? Well, transportation, food, where are you going to stay, things like that. Matter of fact, we're coming to Christmas, and one of the myths of Christmas is that there was no room at the inn. Because the translation that we see, the word inn really means upper room. And so if you understand the way houses were built back then, the bottom would have a kitchen in it and usually a stable of some kind, because you wanted to keep your animals safe. You didn't leave them out at night, because if you left them out at night, somebody would probably steal them. And so you would have an area under the house where you would have your kitchen and where you would have your little stable where you would keep your chickens, goats, whatever, pigs. No pigs. You would keep that stuff. And then upstairs was generally one large room, and that's where everybody slept. And so when they were doing the taxes, you had to return to your hometown. And so generally what you would do, because in those days there were no Motel 6s. We think there's an inn on every corner. Here there is. You don't have to drive very far. I don't care where you go, you can find a hotel. In those days, there were very, very few of them. Oftentimes, they were located generally at the end of a long journey, the road from Jericho to Jerusalem. So when the Good Samaritan, when he got to the end of the journey, there was a place to stay there. But in between, there's nothing. And so when Mary and Joseph were going, they were probably traveling to visit the family. Or they were planning on staying with the family, and when they got there, they said, there's no room for you here, but we can put you downstairs. And so we still see the humble beginning of Christ. But so here's this guy, he coming, and David is saying to him, says, listen, you come, you're going to be a burden on us. We just don't have room for you. But then he's going to tell him some things. He says, but if thou return to the city, now remember, he's already done this with the priest. He said, but if you return to the city and say unto Absalom, he said, I will be thy servant, O king, as I have been with thy father's servants hereunto, and so will I also be thy servant, and that thou mayest through me defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. So David said, hey, I got somebody else that's going to go in town. And he says, and hopefully through what you do, you can negate what Ahithophel's doing. And so you can get information to me through the priest's sons, because you can pass on information to them and they can pass it on to me. And so he's looking at all these different ways, and he's saying, and it's really going to be better for you there than with us, because I can't guarantee we can even feed you. Yeah, so you're going to be a spy. There's a lot of intrigue going on there, isn't there? So this is kind of cool, all the stuff that's taking place. And so he goes back. He says he's going to go and do exactly what David said. Well, we come in chapter 16, we have scene number 5. All these different things we're seeing David is on his journeys. He's stopping to do things, to talk to people, to make plans for what's going on. So in chapter 16, he's just over the summit of the Mount of Olives. The Mountain of Olives itself is on a hill. You got Jerusalem is up here. The Mount of Olives is lower than it, but it's still a kind of mountain. And he's over on the other side of the Mountain of Olives. And in verses 1 through 4, and when David was a little past the top of the hill, behold, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth. Now remember who he is.
Yes.
Who's he?
The lame son of Jonathan. The lame son of Jonathan.
Okay, but that he would Saul's grandson. So we want to keep that. That's a connection. Okay, this guy was a servant to him. He was a servant to Saul's family. But look what he does. And he says, and he comes with a couple of asses saddled upon him with 200 loaves of bread and 100 bunches of raisins and 100 of summer fruit and a bottle of wine. Man, that donkey had to be tired. That's a lot of stuff. I'm just trying to visualize how big these loaves of bread are. 200 of them. So maybe they're just little loaves of bread like this, but 200 of them. And then the raisins, I always thought raisins were nothing but dried grapes. Well, they're not. Raisins are raised to be raisins. You leave them on the vine. They're a particular kind of grape. But you leave them on the vine. You don't take them off the vine and dry them. They dry right on the vine. And so when he says bunches of grapes, I want you to picture a clump of grapes, but these are raisin grapes, and they cut them up, and they're still on the vine. And so he's got these. So he's got this food and stuff that he's bringing with him. And so David wants to know, what is this? Why are you doing this? And he said, and the king said to Ziba, what meanest by these? And Ziba said, the asses are for the king's household to ride in, and the bread and the summer fruits for the young men to eat, and the wine for those who get faint in the wilderness may have drink. And the king said, if there be a master, and where is thy master's son? And Ziba said unto the king, Behold, he abideth in Jerusalem, for he said, Today shall the house of Israel restore me to the kingdom of my father. So what's Mephibosheth trying to do? Yeah. So we've got Absalom who wants to take over, but now we're looking at Saul's son, his son's son, his grandson, who says, I want to restore Saul's kingdom. So now we got some real intrigue going on. But this guy says, I don't want any part of this. He says, because David is the true king, and so he says, I'm going to go with him. And so he brings this stuff. He says, this is here for you to restore you, to make it easier on your family. Because just before that, he said, listen, you can't come with me because we can't take care of you. And all of a sudden, the Lord's providing with some extra stuff for him. So that was scene 5. Scene 6. Now we're just, it's important that you spend some time reading this because we don't have a lot of time to spend in these because of the amount of material to cover. But scene 6 it begins at verse 5. And it says, And King David said unto Bahurim, Behold, thence come out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera, and came forth and cursed still as he came. Now this is one. Can we use the word stupid? Well, I'm using it here because this guy's stupid. He's stupid. I don't know another way to look at it. I was reading this and said, wait a minute. Here's this guy who doesn't like David. He's one of Saul's people. And David's procession is going by his house. And he comes out, and what does he do? Starts throwing stones, calling him names, cursing him, all these different things. And the thing is, some of the things he's saying are true. He says, listen, you're basically a bloody man. He said, because of what you've done. But he's referring to what he did to Saul. Now, David is not responsible for what happened to Saul, but he's blaming David for it. And so he says, listen, and he's doing this. Now, think about this. David's got at least 600 people. He's got a bunch of bodyguards. And this guy's coming out, and can you imagine somebody doing that to the President of the United States? Now, there was something in the news not too long ago after all where they had, I guess, 2 people who were able to get over the fence. One of them actually got in the White House. But this next guy comes over, and they got pictures of the Secret Service tackling him on the front lawn, okay, before he can get very far. Now, apparently they're starting to get their act together. Do you think, this is the king. Do you think he's got anybody around him that's going to help him? Yeah. And in those days, matter of fact, these guys, they go to David and said, David, you want us to go cut his head off? Yeah, that's what they did in those days. You mess with the king, you're dead. It's over. And David tells him no. Whoa. I would think that if somebody was threatening me and doing things like that, throwing rocks and stuff at me, that I'd want somebody to stop him. But David says, now, to make a long story short, David says there's some truth in what he's saying. A lot of it's lies, and a lot of it was, because David was not responsible for Saul's death and the things that happened. But he probably remembers what Nathan had told him and what God was saying. And David's taking this look at it and says, listen, if God's going to restore me, God's going to restore me, but I'm not going to take this guy's life over this. Wow. That's pretty cool of David. Now, some of the other times I wish David would take a stand on things. I think this is maybe one time when David is right and says, there's been too much bloodshed. There's been too much already. There's going to be more, but let's just let this guy go. Let him say his words. Sticks and stones will break your bones, and words will hurt you. So he's saying this stuff. So there's some pain here. I'm sure David is devastated by what he's hearing, but at the same time, I think David realizes I kind of deserve what this guy is saying. Okay, he's not Nathan. He's not a prophet, and the stuff he's saying is kind of a lie. Well, now we come to the last scene, and the last scene is not David, but we're back in Jerusalem, because now Absalom has come to Jerusalem. He knows David has fled. He's come up there. He wants to probably attack David. He wants to but David has already fled. And so in verse 15, and Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. Who's that guy? That was, yeah, that was his buddy. That was his helper. That was his lead assistant kind of guy. That was his Secretary of State or whatever he was. And here he is with them. And it came to pass when Hushai, the Archite, David's friend, now this is a guy David said, hey, go back. In verse 16, and it was come to Absalom that Hushai said unto Absalom, God save the king, God save the king. And Absalom says, huh? Is this some kind of, what about David? Because you were David's friend. What are you doing here? He's being suspicious. He says, why wentest thou not with thy friend? Because normally that's what you should do. But his argument here is going to be, he says, well, when he was king, he was king. Now you're king. And whoever God puts on the throne, that's who I'm going to follow. And so basically he gets himself in. In verse 20 he says, but said Absalom to Ahithophel, give counsel among us of what we shall do. And so he goes to the guy. This is David's counselor. Now he's Absalom's counselor. He says, what should I do? Now here's some wise counsel for you. And he says unto Absalom, he says, go into thy father's concubines. Remember he left 10 of them behind? Now one thing we don't see that when Absalom came into town is he didn't blow a horn. Now typically when the king comes into town to take over, what they would do is they would announce it by blowing the trumpet. And it was a sign that the king was coming to stand on the throne. And so when you came into a new town, if you defeated something, you announced your coming by blowing of the trumpet. But he doesn't do anything like that. So what he's going to do is he's going to come up with a kind of roundabout way to announce, I'm in charge here now. And the way he's going to do it is he's going to do it by fulfilling a prophecy, the prophecy of Nathan. Because Nathan said, not only will your sons die, but someone else will have your wives. And that's just what's going to happen. So here's the big plan. He says, you go in and have your way with the concubines. You take them. They're yours now. You treat David's wives like they're yours now. And in so doing so, you are declaring to the people that I'm in charge now. So I'm not blowing a horn, but I'm doing something that's probably just as strong a message. Because now I'm saying what's David's is mine now. And so he sets up a tent up on top of the building. And he does this so the people can see what he's doing. So he does this very, very publicly to make sure that the people understand that what he's saying. Now, that's what he does. Now, if we go to, I want you to look at the very end of chapter 16. We're not going to go into chapter 17, but I want you to notice something. Because, see, what Absalom has done, he said, I want your counsel. And he actually tells him two things he needs to do. He says, the first thing you need to do is take his concubines, have your way with them. But look at the first verse in chapter 17. And it says, moreover. Now, the word moreover there is probably would have been a whole lot better translated the word and. Because what we've got is a transition here going into chapter 17. And these two things should have been together. The word that's used there, without going into a lot of, is the word vav, V-A-V, that's a Hebrew word, and it means and. For some reason they translated it moreover, which usually has something to do with, besides that, we'll do this. But regularly he's saying, here's the two things you need to do. Take the concubines, and then the second thing he's going to tell them to do is he says, let's get a whole bunch of men together, how about 12,000 of them, and go after David. So this is the counsel David's counselor is given to him. Now, of course, now David's got some spies, and next week we'll get into that. So basically his counsel has been to him to do these two things. He said, first, declare that you're taking over the place by taking the concubines, and secondly, take soldiers and go after him. And so the idea is to kill David. And so here's where David is now. David is on the run. This is something that's not new to David because he was under the same problem with Saul. But now he's running from his own son. And all of this comes about because of what?
Sin.
Sin. and because of the way he handled things. Now, the Bathsheba thing started it all, but some of the things that we've talked about as we've gone along about his failure to do anything with his son. So some things I want to think about as we leave this chapter. This chapter, I think, tells us a lot about friendship. And we need to look and see who our friends are. We need to be careful about our choice of friends and find friends who are not just fair weather friends. I've also counseled with my kids that I'm not their friend. I'm their parent. I don't want to be your friend. I want to be your mom. I want to be your dad. Your mom wants to be your mom. But I don't want to be your friend. That doesn't mean we're not friendly with each other. But there's a totally different relationship, because I find that most of the time when my kids were growing up, that their friends were not often honest with them. That their friends were their friends as long as things were smooth and going well. And oftentimes as friends, they would tell my kids what my kids wanted to hear, not what my kids needed to hear. A true friend is the person who will look at you and say, Billy, wake up. No, he'll say, hey, Billy, I've seen something in your life that's not right, and you need to do something about it. And if I can help you, if I can encourage you, if I can come alongside of you and do something, I'm not just criticizing and say, Billy, you're a loser. No, I'm saying is, the Lord's laid it on my heart to come to you because I've seen this, and to encourage you to turn around and go in the right direction on it. That's what a true friend will do. Not just going like, well, Billy, if that's what you think is okay, then you just do it. Who's going to say, and it's your life, just live it the way you want. A true friend won't do that. And so when we look down through here, we see the different friends that David has. We find this one guy the indication is he's only been there for a day, and yet David looks at him and says, you can go on. He says, no, I'm with you. You're God's man. I'm sticking with you. And then he's had a guy that's been with him since the beginning who kind of got him in trouble earlier on. And this guy's turning tail and running over to the other side. So we really need to be careful about who our friends are. Another thing is that God always keeps his word. We're seeing, as we've been reading through these last few chapters, that when Nathan came to him and said, David, you're the man, and here's what God's going to do. That God does what God is going to do. And so God holds us accountable for our sin. Now, we're not talking about losing our salvation. Okay, our salvation is not based on, I was watching a Dolly Parton movie the other day, about the first half hour of it, where she was a country western singer in some little honky-tonk joint, and she has a car accident and dies, and she goes to heaven. She gets to the gate, and she's ready, and people are walking in the gate, just walking in. She gets to the gate, the door's closed, and she can't get in. She says, what's the scoop? What's going on? And so Peter, of course it's always Peter, and he says, you can't get in. And she says, like, why not? He says, well, quite honestly, you haven't measured up. But now, when she had the accident, the reason she had the accident because a deer walked across the road, she swerved to avoid hitting a deer. And Peter looks at her and says, because you avoided that deer, it shows you've got some kind of compassion in you. There's a little shred of something in you that makes it think that maybe you're worthy to get into heaven, but not sure. So what we're going to do is we're going to send you back to earth, and you've got to somehow redeem this family down there in 4 days, or before Christmas Eve by midnight. Or we're going to put the glass slipper on you, or what? I don't know. And if you can do this good work, you get into heaven. Well, that's not the way it works. Okay, it just doesn't work that way. But there are people who, So I got a kick out of it. I've always thought Dolly Parton was a Christian from other things and things she said. But I said, making that movie, there were so many theological inaccuracies in that thing that it gives the world a total wrong view. God holds us accountable. We don't get to the pearly gates if we haven't trusted Christ. You don't get there at the gate and God says, hey, let me see if you... No, if you aren't in the book, you aren't in. Okay? And you don't get a second chance. But beyond that, God, I believe, holds us accountable for what we do in the flesh. Now, we will answer for that someday too, but I think sometimes we answer for it now. God sets down principles in His Word of how we should deal. Listen, if you treat people bad, how do you think people are going to treat you? Probably bad. It's going to be really difficult. I have a tendency to avoid people who are nasty to me. Am I wrong? Now, I don't say I don't talk to them. I'm not friendly to them. I just don't hang with them. Because if you're going to treat me bad, I don't want to be around you. And so when we wonder, well, why don't people like me? Do you like people first? Well, these are scriptural principles, and I think we pay for them. But anyhow, David is going to pay for his sin, what he did with Bathsheba, and he said, this is what's going to happen. You've lost sons, your daughter was raped, your kingdom is being taken away from you. All this stuff is happening, David, because of what you did. And so God keeps His word. And the other thing that I see in here is I see God's sovereignty, because God brings us all about. God is in control. I don't care what we see happening in the world, what's going on around us, God is still in control. Nothing can take that away. God is not ineffectual. God is not sitting up on His throne, looking down and saying, oh, I hope it works out. Oh, I just hope something happens good. Oh, just maybe. Oh, wouldn't it be great if that, oh. That's not what God does. God will take Billy and He'll use Billy for something. And listen, He used Pharaoh. He used a donkey. He used a whale or a big fish. Can God use us? So God is in control. And so we look at all these different people in David's life that came along. And so these 2 chapters are basically David's journey from leaving Jerusalem and going to hide in the wilderness, and how God is providing. He provided him with food. He provided him with friendship. He provided him with people who could counsel and help him to overcome the people who turned against him. Isn't it awesome what God will do? And God will do the same thing for us. Well, it's time to go. Our Heavenly Father, we do praise Thee for our time together. And Lord, we pray that You bless Your word to our hearts and our minds. And Lord, and through what we see in David's life, that Lord, You will help us in the choice of the friends we have, and teach us to be good friends to those that are around us. And Father, we would always understand that You are totally in control. We thank Thee for it. You are a sovereign, a loving, a holy, a just God. We praise You for it in Jesus' name. Amen. You are dismissed.